Hell's Angel finds a poor girl crying at his son's grave. Her words make him collapse in tears. The engine of Caleb Mercer's Harley-Davidson growled beneath him as he navigated the winding backroads that led to Pinecrest Cemetery. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Caleb rode slower than usual, his broad shoulders hunched slightly forward, his weathered hands gripping the handlebars with unnecessary force. 1 month. It had been 1 month since they put his boy in the ground. The thought formed in his mind with the blunt force of a hammer blow. Caleb clenched his jaw, feeling the muscles tighten along his neck. The leather of his Hell's Angels vest creaked as he shifted his weight. At 45, Caleb had seen his share of hardship, but nothing had prepared him for this hollow feeling that had taken up residence inside his chest. The cemetery was still 2 miles away, but he could already see the hill where it sat, peaceful and green against the darkening sky. Caleb slowed the bike as he approached a bend in the road, the same stretch of asphalt he'd traveled every evening for the past 4 weeks. The routine had become sacred to him. Finish work at the auto shop by 5, ride to the cemetery, sit with his boy until the sun disappeared. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. His son's face flickered in his mind. Round cheeks, bright eyes that crinkled when he laughed. 4 years old, just 4 years old. Caleb swallowed hard. The doctors had explained it all in careful terms. The illness that had appeared suddenly, the treatments that hadn't worked, the inevitable conclusion. He had nodded, understanding the words, but refusing to accept their meaning. Even now, a month later, it felt impossible. Boys were supposed to outlive their fathers. That was the natural order of things. The wind rushed past as Caleb accelerated through a straightaway, the fields on either side blurring into streaks of green and gold. His thoughts drifted to the funeral, the small white casket, the handful of mourners, the deafening silence that followed him home afterward. His brothers from the club had been there, standing at a respectful distance in their leather cuts, offering silent support. They knew better than to offer empty words. Caleb hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't cried at all. The tears stayed locked inside, trapped behind the wall he'd built years ago. Men like him didn't cry. They endured. They carried on. The cemetery gates came into view, simple wrought iron arches that marked the entrance to the small hillside burial ground. Caleb slowed the motorcycle, turning onto the gravel path that wound its way up the gentle slope. The crunch of stones beneath his tires was the only sound as he came to a stop in the small parking area. For a moment, he sat motionless on the bike, staring ahead at nothing in particular. Then, with practiced movements, he shut off the engine, swung his leg over the seat, and removed his helmet. The sudden quiet wrapped around him like a shroud. Caleb ran a hand through his short gray hair and started up the path that led to the newer section of the cemetery. His heavy boots made little sound on the grass as he walked, his face set in the same expressionless mask he wore day after day. Several people who noticed him quickly looked away. His size alone was intimidating. 6'3" of solid muscle, arms covered in tattoos, face etched with the lines of a hard life. The Hell's Angels patch on his back ensured that most people gave him a wide berth. He didn't mind. He preferred the solitude. The small headstone came into view as he crested the hill. Simple granite, with his son's name and the dates that marked his brief life. Caleb stopped in front of it, looking down at the fresh dirt that still hadn't grown grass. Someone, probably the groundskeeper, had removed the wilted flowers from his last visit. Caleb lowered himself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in front of the grave. The setting sun painted the cemetery in shades of orange and red, but he barely noticed the beauty. His eyes were fixed on the headstone, reading the name over and over as if trying to convince himself it was real. The silence stretched on as daylight faded. Caleb sat unmoving, his face a blank canvas that revealed nothing of the storm that raged inside him. This was his vigil, his penance, his way of staying connected to a son who had slipped away too soon. As darkness began to fall, Caleb Mercer stared at his son's grave, lost in a grief too deep for tears. The unexpected visitor. The next evening arrived with the same golden hues painting the sky. Caleb pulled his motorcycle into the cemetery parking lot, the familiar routine bringing a strange comfort. The engine's rumble faded to silence as he cut the ignition. For a moment, he sat motionless on the bike, gathering the strength to face another evening with his grief. His large hands, calloused from years of motorcycle maintenance and hard living, removed his helmet with practiced ease. The air felt cooler today, carrying the first hints of autumn. Caleb zipped his leather jacket higher and began the trek up the hillside, his eyes already fixed on the spot where his son lay buried. But today, something was different. Caleb squinted, then stopped mid-stride. There was movement at his son's grave, a small figure kneeling beside the headstone. His jaw tightened instantly. This was his time, his place to mourn. The cemetery was usually empty at this hour, which was exactly why he came when he did. He continued walking, his pace quickening slightly. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. It was a child, a little girl with thin shoulders and hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. She wore a faded pink sweater that looked a size too small and worn sneakers with mismatched socks. Caleb's brow furrowed deeply. Where were her parents? What was she doing here alone? And more importantly, what was she doing at his son's grave? The cemetery was no place for a child to wander unsupervised. The girl hadn't noticed him yet. Her head was bowed, and she appeared to be talking softly to the grave. The sight struck Caleb as both odd and intrusive. This was his private time of mourning, not a playground for neighborhood kids. He stopped about 20 feet away, watching her. The girl's small fingers traced the letters on his son's headstone with a familiarity that made Caleb's chest tighten uncomfortably. She wasn't just passing by. She seemed to be visiting the grave intentionally. "Who are you?" The question formed in his mind but didn't make it to his lips. Instead, he stood frozen, caught between curiosity and irritation. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees that dotted the cemetery grounds. A few early fallen leaves skittered across the grass between them. The girl seemed oblivious to the dropping temperature, still kneeling in the grass, her lips moving in what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with the grave. Caleb felt a surge of protectiveness, not for the girl, but for his son's memory. This was sacred ground to him. Each evening, he came here to sit in silence, to remember, to try to make sense of a world that had taken his child. He didn't share this ritual with anyone, not even his brothers from the club. And now this strange child was intruding on the only piece he had left. His hands clenched involuntarily at his sides, the leather of his fingerless gloves creaking softly. The patch on his back, the death's head insignia of the Hells Angels, caught the fading sunlight as he straightened his shoulders. Most people would see him coming and scramble to get out of his way. Children especially tended to give him a wide berth, intimidated by his size and the hard lines of his face. But this little girl still hadn't noticed him. She continued whispering to his son's grave, occasionally nodding as if receiving answers to questions Caleb couldn't hear. The irritation building inside him finally propelled him forward. His boots crushed the grass beneath him as he walked toward the grave, his shadow stretching long and dark across the ground. Whatever game this child was playing, it was about to end. This was his time with his son, not hers. As he approached, he could see she had placed something small and colorful on top of the grave. Some kind of toy. That detail only added to his growing annoyance. His son's resting place wasn't a dollhouse or a make-believe setting. Caleb's face settled into the intimidating mask he wore when dealing with unwanted attention. His jaw set firmly, eyes narrowed slightly, mouth pressed into a hard line. It was an expression that had caused grown men to step back, to reconsider whatever course of action had drawn his displeasure. With each step closer to the girl and his son's grave, his irritation mounted. He would send her away, firmly but without frightening her too badly, and reclaim this space that belonged to him and his grief alone. As Caleb drew closer, the little girl remained unaware of his approach. The evening breeze carried snatches of her whispered words to him, though he couldn't make them out clearly. His shadow finally stretched across the grave, darkening the space where she knelt. The girl continued talking, her voice small but earnest. Caleb stood silently behind her, close enough now to hear her clearly. "I know it's been a while," she was saying, her tiny fingers still tracing the letters on the headstone. "The doctors wouldn't let me come sooner. But I promised, didn't I?" Caleb frowned, confusion momentarily replacing his irritation. She spoke as if she knew his son. But that wasn't possible. His boy had been sick for so long, mostly confined to hospital rooms and their home. "Remember our secret handshake?" The girl demonstrated something with her hands above the grave. "The nurses thought we were just being silly, but we knew it was important club business." Club business. Caleb's frown deepened. What was she talking about? "I told you I'd come back, even if you went first." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat. The simple sentence, spoken in that small, trembling voice, pierced straight through the armor he'd built around himself. The girl still hadn't noticed him standing there. "I keep our stories going, just like I said I would. Yesterday, I imagined the blue motorcycle jumped over 3 whole buildings." She sighed softly. "It's not as fun without you, though." Caleb felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking on a frozen river. His son had never mentioned making friends at the hospital. But then again, toward the end, there had been so many things left unsaid between them. "I miss you," the girl whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "The new kid in room 12 doesn't want to play motorcycle club. He just plays video games." Motorcycle club. The words echoed in Caleb's mind. His knees suddenly felt weak. The little girl reached into the pocket of her worn sweater and pulled out something small. She placed it carefully on top of the grave. "I brought him back to visit you. You can keep him for a while if you want." Caleb could now see it was a small toy motorcycle, its blue paint chipped and worn from countless hours of play. "Your dad hasn't come yet today," she continued, glancing around the cemetery. "You said he always comes when the sun looks like it's touching the trees." Something broke inside Caleb then. A dam that had held back a month of unshed tears suddenly crumbled. The girl knew things, specific things about him, that only his son could have told her. His son had talked about him. His legs gave way without warning. Caleb dropped heavily to his knees on the grass just behind the girl, startling her. She turned quickly, her eyes widening at the sight of him. This huge man in a leather jacket, with Hell's Angels emblazoned across the back, tattoos climbing up his neck, his face now streaked with tears that seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. "You're him," she said simply, recognition dawning in her eyes. "You're his dad." Caleb couldn't speak. His throat had closed up entirely. His chest heaved with the effort of containing sobs that threatened to tear him apart. All these weeks, he'd maintained his composure, had shown the world the stoic face everyone expected from him. He hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't broken down when he packed away his son's toys, hadn't allowed himself to feel the full magnitude of his loss. But here, now, faced with this tiny stranger who somehow knew his son, who had been important enough for his boy to talk about his dad, Caleb fell apart completely. Tears flowed freely down his weathered face. His broad shoulders shook with silent sobs. The carefully constructed walls he'd built to contain his grief collapsed all at once, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't been since he was a child himself. The little girl watched him with solemn eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. She didn't seem frightened by his breakdown or his imposing appearance. Instead, she looked at him with something like recognition, as if she'd been expecting him all along. Caleb struggled to compose himself, wiping roughly at his face with the back of his hand. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to regain control. The little girl watched him patiently, showing no fear of the large, tattooed man breaking down before her. When his breathing finally steadied, she scooted a bit closer on her knees, the hem of her faded dress dragging in the grass. "My name is Lily," she said, her voice clear and direct. "Lily Carter. I knew your son." Caleb swallowed hard, his throat still tight with emotion. "How?" he managed to croak out. Lily tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "We were neighbors, at the hospital. My bed was next to his in the children's wing." She spoke with the straightforward honesty of a child, no hint of deception or guile in her face. Her eyes were too old for someone so young, the kind of eyes that had seen pain and understood it. "He never mentioned—" Caleb started, then stopped. There was so much his son hadn't told him, so many conversations they'd never had. "We weren't supposed to leave our rooms at night," Lily continued, settling more comfortably beside the grave. "But sometimes when the nurses were busy, we'd sneak out and sit in the playroom when no one was there. He said it was our secret clubhouse." Caleb stared at her, trying to picture his quiet son, always so obedient, breaking rules and having adventures he'd never known about. "How long did you know him?" Caleb asked, his voice still rough. 3 months and 12 days, Lily answered promptly. "That's how long I was there last time. Before that, I'd see him sometimes during my checkups." She spoke matter-of-factly about her hospital stays, as if they were as normal as school or playdates. Caleb noticed how thin her arms were, how pale her skin looked in the fading light. "You're sick too," he said, the realization dawning on him. Lily nodded. "Same as him. But I'm doing okay right now." She said it with such acceptance that Caleb felt a fresh wave of grief wash over him. "He talked about you all the time," she added, her eyes brightening. "He said you were the strongest person in the whole world." Caleb's chest tightened. "He said that?" "Uh-huh. He told me you could lift a motorcycle with one hand." Despite everything, Caleb felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips. That might have been a bit of an exaggeration. "I figured," Lily said with a small shrug. "But he believed it. He said that's why you were the president of your club." Caleb's expression sobered. His son had known he was part of the Hells Angels, but they'd never really talked about it. He'd always tried to keep that part of his life separate from his family. "He loved your motorcycle," Lily continued, unaware of Caleb's internal struggle. "He said it was the most beautiful thing in the world, except for maybe the stars." Caleb remembered the rare occasions when he'd taken his son for gentle rides around their neighborhood, the boys' delighted laughter, and tiny hands clutching his jacket. Lily reached for the small object she'd placed on the grave earlier. She held it up for Caleb to see clearly, a die-cast toy motorcycle, painted blue, with tiny scratches and chips from constant handling. "This was his favorite," she said, her small fingers turning the toy carefully. "One of the nurses gave it to him for Christmas. He let me borrow it sometimes, but only if I promised to be careful." Caleb reached out with trembling fingers, hesitating before touching the toy. Lily placed it gently in his palm. It felt impossibly small against his calloused hand. "We started a club," she said, her eyes lighting up with the memory. "The Blue Riders. Just me and him. We made up stories about riding motorcycles all over the world, having adventures and helping people." She looked up at Caleb earnestly. "He said we based it on your club, but we made some changes. In our club, the main rule was you had to be brave, even when you were scared." Caleb stared at the toy in his hand, completely stunned. His son had created a whole world inspired by him, a world he'd never known existed until now. He said his dad was the leader of the bravest club in the world, Lily added quietly. The words struck Caleb with physical force. All this time, he'd thought his son had been afraid of who he was, embarrassed by his rough appearance and lifestyle. Instead, the boy had been proud enough to create a fantasy world around it. To share that pride with his friend, Caleb closed his fingers gently around the toy motorcycle. This precious evidence of a side of his son he'd never known. Caleb watched as a middle-aged woman in scrubs approached from the cemetery entrance. She waved to Lily, who rose from her spot beside the grave. "That's my nurse, Miss Paula," Lily explained, brushing grass from her dress. "She brings me here when she can." Caleb nodded, still clutching the toy motorcycle. Will you come back?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, almost pleading. Lily smiled. "I promised him I would, so I will." She pointed to the toy. "You can keep that until next time. He'd want you to have it tonight." Before Caleb could respond, she reached out and patted his arm with her small hand, the gesture so unexpected that he froze. Then she turned and skipped toward her waiting nurse, looking back once to wave. Caleb raised his hand in a small wave, watching until she disappeared through the cemetery gates. The evening had grown cooler, shadows lengthening across the graves, but he couldn't bring himself to leave yet. His mind was a storm of thoughts and memories, trying to reconcile the son he thought he knew with the boy Lily had described. He turned the small toy over in his hands, examining every scratch and worn spot. His son's fingerprints were on this tiny motorcycle, invisible but present, along with the traces of all those secret games and stories he'd never heard. "Why didn't you tell me, buddy?" he whispered to the headstone. The marble gave no answer, just reflected the last light of day. Caleb settled back against the oak tree near the grave, his legs stretched out on the grass. He tried to picture his son and Lily in the hospital playroom, whispering about their make-believe motorcycle club. The image brought both comfort and pain. All those nights he'd worked late or stayed out with his brothers from the club. All those mornings when he'd been too tired or hungover to really talk to his son. He'd told himself he was providing for his family, doing what men did. But now he saw the cost of those choices, a whole part of his son's life he'd missed completely. "The Blue Riders," he murmured, testing the name on his tongue. A club where bravery was the main rule, not loyalty or strength or silence. His son had taken what he knew of his father's world and transformed it into something pure and good. The thought sent a fresh wave of grief through him. The boy had seen him clearly, had admired him even, and Caleb had never known, had never asked the right questions, had never stayed long enough to hear the answers. He remembered how his son would sometimes ask to sit on his motorcycle in the driveway. Caleb had always kept those moments brief, worried about neighbors seeing, concerned about keeping his family separate from his club life. Now he understood those requests differently. They weren't just about a child's curiosity, but about connecting to his father's world, building a bridge Caleb hadn't recognized. Darkness settled fully over the cemetery. The only sounds were distant traffic and the rustle of leaves above him. Caleb's fingers traced the outline of his son's name on the headstone. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have listened more. Should have been there more." The confession hung in the night air, inadequate but necessary. 4 years wasn't enough time. He should have had decades with his son, not brief scattered moments between club meetings and runs. Finally, when the chill became too much to ignore, Caleb pushed himself to his feet. His joints ached from sitting so long on the hard ground. He tucked the toy motorcycle carefully into his jacket pocket, making sure it was secure. The walk back to his bike seemed longer than usual. Each step felt heavy with the weight of what he'd learned. His son had created a whole world that Caleb had never been invited to enter. Not because the boy hadn't wanted him there, but because Caleb had made himself unavailable. He swung his leg over his Harley, the familiar motion now tinged with new meaning. This machine, this symbol of his identity, had meant something different to his son than it did to him. To Caleb, it represented freedom, brotherhood, escape. To his son, it had been the foundation of fantasy and hope. The engine roared to life, breaking the cemetery silence. Caleb sat for a moment, letting the vibration travel through his body. Then he pulled away slowly, his headlight cutting through the darkness. As he rode the empty streets toward home, the toy motorcycle pressed against his chest, inside his pocket. Caleb felt the full burden of his ignorance, all the stories he'd never heard, all the dreams he'd never shared, all the times his son had reached for him, and he'd been looking the other way, too busy being Iron Cal, the feared Hell's Angel, to be what his son needed most, just Dad. The next evening, Caleb arrived at the cemetery well before sunset. Usually, he timed his visits for that golden hour when the day faded into darkness, matching his mood. But today was different. He parked his motorcycle and glanced at his watch, almost an hour earlier than his normal time. He couldn't admit it to himself fully, but he was waiting for Lily. The toy motorcycle sat heavy in his jacket pocket. He'd spent last night cleaning it carefully with a soft cloth, working out tiny bits of dirt from the wheels, polishing the dull metal until it gleamed as much as a well-loved toy could. He wasn't sure why he'd done that, except it felt important somehow. Caleb settled in his usual spot by his son's grave, but he couldn't find his normal stillness. He shifted his weight, checked the time again, scanned the cemetery entrance. The handful of other visitors, an elderly man placing flowers, a middle-aged couple standing quietly by a fresh grave, paid him no mind. His size and the patches on his leather vest usually ensured people gave him space. "You'd laugh at me now, wouldn't you?" he said softly to the headstone. "Your tough old dad, nervous about talking to a little girl." A bird landed on the grave marker, tilting its head as if listening. "She knows more about you than I do," Caleb continued, his voice rough with emotion. "How did that happen?" The bird chirped once and flew away. Caleb watched it go, wondering what his brothers would think if they could see him now, talking to birds and graves, and waiting for a 5-year-old girl like she was the most important meeting of his life. Maybe she was. Time dragged. The sun inched lower. Caleb pulled out the toy motorcycle and turned it over in his hands, noticing details he'd missed before. A tiny sticker nearly worn away on the gas tank. A scratch that had been colored in with blue marker, the way the front wheel didn't spin quite right. "Come on, kid," he muttered, looking toward the cemetery gates again. "Where are you?" Just as he was beginning to think she wouldn't come, that yesterday had been some kind of strange dream or a one-time visit, he spotted them. The nurse from yesterday walking hand in hand with Lily, who wore a pink hat that seemed too big for her small head. Caleb straightened up, suddenly uncertain. Should he wave, call out, pretend he hadn't been waiting? Before he could decide, Lily spotted him and broke into a wide smile. She tugged at her nurse's hand, pulling her along faster. "You came back," Lily called as they approached, her voice bright in the quiet cemetery. "Yeah," Caleb said, feeling oddly shy. "I had your motorcycle." He held out the toy, and Lily's eyes widened at its improved condition. "You fixed it!" She took it carefully, turning it to examine every angle. "It looks almost new again." The nurse smiled at Caleb. "That was kind of you," she said. "Lily talked about meeting you all day." She glanced at her watch. "I have to make a quick call. Can I leave her with you for a few minutes?" Caleb nodded, surprised by the trust. The nurse stepped away, pulling out her phone, while Lily settled cross-legged by the grave, looking completely at ease. "I told everyone at the hospital that I met Tommy's dad," she said, placing the toy motorcycle carefully on top of the grave. "I said you were just as big as Tommy said you were." Caleb's heart tightened at his son's name. What else did he say about me? He asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. Lily smiled, revealing a missing front tooth. He said you were the strongest person in the whole world, and that your motorcycle was the fastest. She tilted her head, studying him. He said sometimes you looked scary to other people, but never to him. Caleb swallowed hard. We didn't talk much, him and me. That's okay, Lily said with the simple wisdom of children. Tommy said you talked in different ways, like when you fixed his toys or carried him when he was too tired to walk. She reached out and patted the grave gently. He knew you loved him a whole bunch. Did he? Caleb paused, searching for the right words. Did he tell you about our home? About things we did together? Lily nodded eagerly. He told me about how you let him sit on your motorcycle sometimes, and how you made the best peanut butter sandwiches because you cut them into triangles instead of squares. Caleb blinked in surprise. He'd forgotten that. How his son had insisted triangle sandwiches tasted better. Such a small thing, but it had mattered to the boy. What else did he tell you about? Caleb asked, leaning forward slightly. About our life? About me? Lily hugged her knees to her chest, thinking hard about Caleb's question. The evening air grew cooler around them as shadows lengthened across the cemetery. He said you always checked under his bed for monsters, she said finally. Even though you both knew monsters weren't real. He said it was your special joke. Caleb nodded slowly. It was true. Every night, without fail, he'd made a show of checking, dramatically looking under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. His son would giggle, knowing what was coming next. And he told me about your special handshake, Lily continued, brightening. She held out her tiny hand. Can I show you? Caleb hesitated, then extended his massive hand. Her fingers were so small against his calloused palm. First you go like this, she said, tapping her palm against his. Then like this. She made a fist and bumped it against his knuckles. Then you pull back and go whoosh. She wiggled her fingers as she pulled her hand away. The familiar motions sent a jolt through Caleb's heart. He hadn't done that handshake since before his son got sick the final time. We did that every morning, he said quietly, before I left for work. He showed me during scary treatments, Lily said, when I was crying. He said his dad taught him to be brave. Caleb's throat tightened. He hadn't known that. Hadn't known his son had passed on their small ritual as a gift of courage. What about the club? Caleb asked. The motorcycle club you two had? Lily's face lit up. That was the best part. We called it the Road Warriors. Tommy was the president because it was his idea, but I was vice president. She pointed to the toy motorcycle. We made badges out of paper, but the toys were real. Tommy said his was just like yours. It is, Caleb confirmed. Same model, just smaller. He said when he got better, you'd teach him to ride a real one someday, Lily said, running her finger along the toy's handlebars. We used to pretend we were riding all over the world. Sometimes when the doctors had to do something scary, we'd close our eyes and go on rides instead. Caleb's vision blurred. His son had never told him about these imaginary journeys. Where did you ride to? He asked. Everywhere. Lily threw her arms wide. The beach, mountains, even the moon sometimes. Tommy knew lots of places because of the books you read him. Another surprise. Caleb had indeed read to his son every night, adventure stories mostly, but he hadn't realized how much the boy had absorbed, how those stories had fueled his imagination during the hard days in the hospital. He said you did all the character voices, Lily added with a giggle. Even the girl ones. A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. I sounded pretty silly doing those. Tommy said it made him laugh so hard his tummy hurt, Lily said. She looked down at the grave, her expression softening. He said that's what he missed most in the hospital, the laughing. Caleb felt something crack inside him. All those hospital visits, sitting stiff and silent by his son's bed, afraid to show weakness, afraid his own fear would make things worse. "He really talked about me?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All the time," Lily assured him. The nurses would come in, and he'd say, "My dad's a road warrior. He's coming to see me today." She paused, picking at the grass beside the grave. "He kept your picture by his bed. The one of you holding him on your motorcycle." Caleb remembered the photo. His wife had taken it 3 summers ago, before everything fell apart. Lily looked up at him suddenly, her eyes serious. "Tommy told me something else, too." "What's that?" Caleb asked. "He said you used to smile, before you got sad all the time." Her voice was gentle, without judgment. "He showed me the picture to prove it. You had a really big smile in it." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He just sat there as the setting sun painted the cemetery in gold and red. He hadn't realized his son had noticed the change in him, how the worry and fear had gradually stripped away his ability to smile, to laugh, to be the father his son remembered and talked about to Lily. The nurse called Lily's name from nearby, signaling it was time to go. "I have to leave now," Lily said, standing up and brushing grass from her pants. "But I can come back tomorrow if you want." Caleb nodded, still unable to speak around the lump in his throat. As Lily walked away, holding the nurse's hand, Caleb stared at his son's grave, the words echoing in his mind. "You used to smile, before you got sad all the time." The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving him alone in the gathering darkness, with a truth he hadn't been ready to face. Caleb stood in his garage, staring at his workbench without seeing it. The wrench in his hand felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. He'd been trying to fix the carburetor on his backup motorcycle for over an hour, but his mind kept drifting back to Lily's words. "You used to smile, before you got sad all the time." He set the wrench down with a clang that echoed off the concrete walls. Memories flickered through his mind, memories of himself, before grief had carved him hollow. Reading bedtime stories with funny voices, the special monster checking routine, the secret handshake that had somehow become a talisman of courage for his son. And his son had noticed when the smiles stopped coming. Caleb glanced at the clock mounted above his tool rack. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon. Hours before, he usually went to the cemetery, but he couldn't focus on anything else today. His chest felt tight, like something was trying to push its way out. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked to the small bathroom in the corner of the garage. The face that looked back at him from the mirror was hard, lined with years of keeping emotions locked down tight. When had that happened? When had he stopped being the man his son described to Lily? Caleb showered quickly and changed into clean clothes. He pulled a box from the top shelf of his closet and dug through it until he found what he was looking for. A small photo album he hadn't opened since the funeral. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped it open to the picture Lily had mentioned. There he was, sitting proudly on his motorcycle, his son perched in front of him. Both of them were grinning wildly, matching smiles that crinkled their eyes and showed their teeth. Happiness radiated from the image. "There you are," Caleb whispered to his former self. He tucked the photo into his jacket pocket and headed for his bike. The cemetery was quiet in the afternoon sun. No funerals today, just the occasional visitor leaving flowers at a grave. Caleb parked in his usual spot and walked the familiar path to his son's headstone. As he expected, Lily wasn't there yet. She usually came in the evening, after whatever treatments or appointments filled her days. Caleb sat down beside the grave and pulled out the photograph. "I didn't know you talked about me so much," he said softly to the headstone. I don't know what I thought." He traced his son's face in the photo with one rough fingertip. I'm sorry I stopped smiling, he continued. I didn't mean to. The afternoon passed slowly. Caleb didn't move, just sat watching the shadows lengthen across the grass. For the first time since the funeral, he felt something other than the heavy numbness that had become his constant companion. It wasn't exactly peace, more like purpose. He wanted to hear more from Lily, needed to hear more. When he finally heard footsteps approaching, Caleb looked up to see Lily walking toward him, holding the hand of the same nurse as before. The girl looked tired today, a little pale, but her face brightened when she spotted him. "You're early," she called out. Caleb stood, brushing grass from his jeans. "Thought I might catch you before dark today." The nurse gave him a curious look, but released Lily's hand after a brief conversation about when she'd return. As the woman walked away, Lily carefully sat down beside the grave, arranging her legs crisscross. "I brought something," Caleb said, surprising himself. He hadn't planned this. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and handed it to Lily. "Is this the one you saw?" Lily's eyes widened as she took the photo. "Yes, this is it. Tommy kept it right next to his bed." She studied it closely. "See? You have a really good smile." Something warm flickered in Caleb's chest as he sat down beside her, closer than he had the day before. Not so stiff, not so guarded. "What else did you and Tommy talk about?" he asked. Lily placed the photo carefully on her lap. "We talked about lots of things, about the road warriors, and the places we'd go when we got better." She smiled up at him. "And he told me all about how you build motorcycles. He said you can fix anything." Caleb settled back against the tree trunk, his posture relaxing for the first time in months. "Why don't you tell me more about this club of yours?" he said. Caleb stood in the middle of the toy aisle, completely out of his element. The bright colors and cheerful packaging seemed to mock his uncertainty. Around him, parents confidently selected items while he hesitated, hands stuffed in his leather jacket pockets. He hadn't planned to stop at the store. The idea had ambushed him during his morning coffee, a sudden urge to bring something for Lily. But now that he was here, surrounded by dolls and action figures, he realized he had no idea what a 5-year-old girl might like. "Can I help you find something, sir?" A young store clerk approached with a friendly smile. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "I need something for a little girl. She's 5. Any particular interests? Princesses? Animals? Art supplies?" Caleb thought about what he knew of Lily. "She likes motorcycles," he said. Then, remembering her colorful backpack, he added, "and maybe drawing." The clerk nodded and guided him to a section with coloring books. "These are popular with that age group, and they're good for hospital stays or quiet activities." Caleb's head jerked up. "How'd you know she's in the hospital?" The clerk's smile turned sympathetic. "Just a guess. Most adults shopping alone for children are either buying gifts for birthdays or for kids who are sick." Caleb nodded, embarrassed by his defensive reaction. He selected a coloring book with motorcycles and vehicles, then added a pack of crayons with 36 colors. As he was heading to the register, he spotted a small, plush black cat with bright green eyes. Without overthinking it, he grabbed that too. At the checkout, he felt strangely self-conscious, a hulking man in a leather jacket, buying children's items. But the cashier didn't bat an eye, just rang up his purchases and placed them in a bright blue bag. "Would you like a gift receipt?" she asked. "No," Caleb replied. "It's not that kind of gift." He wasn't sure what kind of gift it was exactly. An offering, a peace gesture. He just knew he wanted to see Lily smile. Back in his truck, Caleb placed the bag carefully on the passenger seat. The afternoon sun slanted through the windshield as he drove toward the cemetery. He found himself checking the time repeatedly, hoping he wouldn't miss her. The cemetery was quiet when he arrived. No sign of Lily yet. Caleb sat near his son's grave and waited, the blue bag beside him. He felt nervous, which struck him as ridiculous. He was a grown man, worried about whether a child would like his gifts. "What am I doing here, Tommy?" he murmured to the headstone. "Your dad's turning soft." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He wasn't turning soft. He was remembering who he had been before grief hardened him. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. Lily walked slowly toward him, holding her nurse's hand. Today she wore a yellow sweater that seemed too big for her small frame, and her curly hair was partially hidden under a knitted hat despite the warm afternoon. "You're here again!" Lily called out, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. Caleb stood up, suddenly self-conscious about the blue bag. What if she thought it was weird? What if the gifts were all wrong? "Hey, kid," he said as she approached. The nurse nodded to him and stepped back, giving them space while remaining within sight. Lily settled down beside the grave and immediately noticed the bag. "What's that?" Caleb cleared his throat. "Just some stuff I thought you might like." He handed her the bag, his large hands making it look even smaller. Lily's eyes widened as she took it. "For me? Really?" She peered inside with an expression of wonder that made Caleb's chest tighten. "It's not much," he said gruffly. But Lily was already pulling out the coloring book, her face lighting up. "Motorcycles! Look, it has choppers like yours." She flipped through the pages excitedly, then gasped when she discovered the crayons. So many colors! When she reached the bottom of the bag and found the stuffed cat, her entire face transformed. "Oh, he's perfect!" She hugged the plush animal to her chest. "Reminded me of a stray that used to hang around my garage," Caleb explained, watching her reaction carefully. "Tommy used to leave milk out for it." "I'm going to name him Ryder," Lily declared, stroking the cat's soft fur, "because he can ride with us in the Road Warriors." Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Caleb's chest as he watched her arrange her gifts beside her. It wasn't happiness exactly. That seemed too big, too distant still. But it was something close to contentment, a small crack in the wall of grief he'd built around himself. "Thank you," Lily said, looking up at him with earnest eyes. "Nobody brings me presents except at Christmas." "It's nothing," Caleb mumbled, but the warmth in his chest expanded. The sunset painted the cemetery in gentle orange and pink hues. Caleb sat with his back against a nearby tree, watching as Lily carefully colored a motorcycle in her new book. She had chosen a bright red crayon and was focusing hard on staying inside the lines. Her tongue poked out slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration. They had talked for nearly an hour. Lily had shared more stories about her and Tommy's time in the hospital together. How they would pretend their beds were speeding motorcycles. How they would race down the hallway during their brief moments of energy. And how they would make up secret handshakes that only members of their Road Warriors Club could know. Caleb had found himself speaking more than usual too. He told her about taking Tommy for rides on his motorcycle when he was just 3, keeping one strong arm wrapped around his tiny body. He described Tommy's favorite ice cream shop, and how the boy would always get chocolate with rainbow sprinkles, ending up with more on his face than in his stomach. Now they had fallen into a comfortable silence. The evening air was cool, but not cold. A light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. "I think he would like this color," Lily said suddenly, holding up her partially finished picture. The motorcycle gleamed bright red against the white page. "Yeah," Caleb nodded. "Red was his favorite." "How'd you know that?" Lily shrugged, returning to her coloring. "He told me. He said his dad's first bike was red." Caleb felt that familiar tightness in his throat. His first motorcycle had indeed been red. A beaten-up Honda he'd restored himself when he was barely 20. He hadn't realized Tommy had paid attention to those old stories. "It was," he confirmed quietly. "Not much to look at, but it ran good." Lily nodded seriously, as if this was important information. She set down the red crayon and picked up a black one, beginning to color the tires. The silence returned, but Caleb noticed something strange about it. Usually, silence felt like a weight pressing down on him, especially here at the cemetery. It was a reminder of all the words he'd never said to his son, all the conversations they would never have. But tonight, with Lily's quiet presence beside him, the silence felt different. It felt peaceful. Ryder the stuffed cat sat propped against Tommy's headstone, its bright green eyes watching over them both. Lily had positioned it there, explaining that Ryder needed to get to know Tommy too. Caleb leaned his head back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes for a moment. The sound of Lily's crayon, scratching against paper, mixed with the distant chirping of crickets, beginning their evening songs. Somewhere far off, a car drove by on the main road, its engine fading into the distance. When he opened his eyes again, he found Lily watching him. "You look less sad when you're quiet now," she observed. "Do I?" Caleb asked, surprised by her perception. She nodded. "Before, you looked like you were hurting inside. Now you look more like you're just thinking." Caleb considered this. The raw, jagged edges of his grief did feel somewhat smoother tonight. Not gone. He doubted they ever would be, but less likely to tear him apart from the inside. "Maybe I am," he said. Lily went back to her coloring. She had started working on the background now, adding a blue sky above the motorcycle. Her small hand moved the crayon in careful, deliberate strokes. Caleb watched her work, noting how the fading sunlight caught in her curls. Despite everything, despite the hospital stays and the illness that had taken his son, this little girl approached life with such focus and joy. She treated a simple coloring book like a masterpiece in progress. The silence between them stretched on, but it no longer felt empty. Instead, it felt full of small sounds. Lily's breathing, the whisper of crayon on paper, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird heading home for the evening. For the first time since Tommy's death, Caleb realized he wasn't desperately trying to fill the quiet with thoughts or memories or regrets. He was simply existing in it, sharing this peaceful moment with a child who had somehow broken through his defenses. The silence that had once been his enemy now felt almost like a friend. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of Caleb's garage, casting long beams across the concrete floor. Tools lined the walls, wrenches, pliers, and screwdrivers hanging in neat rows from a pegboard. The space smelled of motor oil and metal, scents that had always brought Caleb comfort. Today, he sat hunched over his workbench, but he wasn't working on a Harley. Between his large, calloused fingers, he held Lily's tiny toy motorcycle. The small metal bike looked almost comical in his hands. The hands that could disassemble and rebuild a V-twin engine, blindfolded now, carefully turning a toy no bigger than his palm. The motorcycle had seen better days. The red paint was chipped and faded in spots. One of the handlebars was bent slightly inward. The miniature kickstand was broken off completely. Worst of all, the front wheel wouldn't spin freely anymore. "Let's fix you up," Caleb murmured to himself. He pulled his work lamp closer, its bright beam illuminating every scratch and dent in the toy. With surprising gentleness, he began disassembling the small parts. First, he removed the tiny wheels, placing them carefully in a small dish. Next came the handlebars and seat. This was what he knew. This was what made sense. When things broke, you fixed them. When parts wore out, you replaced them. If only grief worked the same way. Caleb reached for his smallest flathead screwdriver and carefully straightened the bent handlebar. His brow furrowed in concentration as he worked, the muscles in his forearms flexing with each precise movement. Tommy liked this little bike, he said out loud to the empty garage. Talking to himself was new, but somehow it felt right. Must have meant something to him to give it to her. From a drawer beneath his workbench, he pulled out a small bottle of model paint, bright red, almost the exact color of the toy's original finish. He'd bought it years ago for a different project, but never used it. With a tiny brush, he began touching up the scratches and chips. His hand, usually steady enough to thread a needle, trembled slightly as he worked. This wasn't just any repair job. This was something that had connected his son to Lily, something that mattered. Should have paid more attention, he mumbled as he worked. All those club stories, those games they played. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple as he focused on a particularly detailed section. The morning grew warmer, but Caleb barely noticed. He was lost in his work, in the meditative rhythm of restoration. After the paint dried, he oiled the wheel bearings and replaced the missing kickstand with a small piece of metal he cut and shaped himself. He polished each part until it gleamed, then carefully reassembled the motorcycle piece by piece. When he finished, he held it up to the light. The transformation was remarkable. The little motorcycle shone like new, its red paint vibrant, its chrome parts gleaming. The wheels spun freely now. It looked like it could zoom off his palm and ride across the workbench. "There you go," he said softly. "Good as new." Caleb set the toy down and stood up, stretching his back. His watch showed nearly noon. He'd been working for hours without realizing it. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten breakfast. Before heading inside, he found a small cardboard box and lined it with a clean shop rag. He placed the restored motorcycle inside, then carefully closed the lid. He didn't wrap it. That seemed too formal, but he wanted to protect it until he could give it back to Lily. As he walked toward the house, box in hand, Caleb felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It wasn't happiness exactly. That emotion still felt too distant, but it was something like purpose, like he had done something right, something that would make Tommy proud. The afternoon passed slowly as Caleb waited for evening to come. He found himself checking the clock every half hour, impatient for the time when he would see Lily again at the cemetery. The small box sat on his kitchen counter, a reminder of the task he'd completed, the connection he'd preserved. When the time finally came, Caleb rode to the cemetery with the box secured carefully in his jacket pocket. The evening air felt cool against his face as he navigated the familiar roads. His heart beat a little faster than usual, anticipating Lily's reaction. The sunset painted the cemetery in soft orange and purple hues as Caleb sat beside Lily on the small bench near his son's grave. The restored toy motorcycle rested between them, its red paint catching the fading light. Lily hadn't stopped smiling since he'd given it to her an hour ago, her small fingers tracing the newly repaired wheels over and over. "It rolls perfect now," she said, demonstrating by pushing it along the bench's wooden slats. Caleb nodded, watching the tiny wheels spin. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. They'd grown used to these quiet moments together. But tonight, something stirred inside Caleb, a need to speak, to share, to connect beyond their usual wordless companionship. "Tommy got that motorcycle for his 3rd birthday," Caleb said suddenly, his deep voice startling a nearby bird into flight. Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide with interest. It was the first time he'd volunteered information about his son without her asking first. "I remember the day clearly," he continued, staring at the headstone. "It was a Saturday, sunny, like today. We had a small party at the house." Caleb cleared his throat, finding the words difficult but necessary. Tommy had been asking for a motorcycle toy for months, kept saying he wanted to be like his dad. A hint of a smile crossed his face. When he opened that gift, his whole face lit up like Christmas morning. Lily nodded solemnly, cradling the toy with new appreciation. "He carried it everywhere after that," Caleb said, his voice growing softer. "Even to bed. I'd find it under his pillow sometimes." He paused, swallowing hard. "One night, maybe a week after his birthday, I heard him in his room after bedtime. He was making engine noises." The memory washed over Caleb, the hallway light casting shadows, the door cracked just enough to see inside. Tommy in his dinosaur pajamas, the motorcycle zooming across his blankets as he whispered, "Vroom, vroom," in the darkness. I should have gone in, Caleb admitted. Should have played with him. But I just watched from the doorway. Thought he needed his sleep. His large hands curled into fists on his knees, then slowly relaxed. Anyway, that's how I know this little bike meant something to him, he finished awkwardly. Lily looked at the toy with renewed wonder, then up at Caleb. He named it Red Lightning, she said. Red Lightning, Caleb repeated, tasting the words. Tommy had never mentioned that name to him. He told me it was the fastest bike in the world, Lily continued, even faster than your real motorcycle. A surprised laugh escaped Caleb's throat, a rusty sound, like an engine turning over after a long winter. We used to race them up and down the hospital halls when the nurses weren't looking, Lily said, her voice animated. Not for real racing, just pretend. He always let me win sometimes. She demonstrated with her hands how they would push imaginary motorcycles through the air. Sometimes we'd build ramps with books from the playroom, she added. We'd see whose bike could jump the farthest. Caleb listened, transfixed. It was as if she was describing a child he'd never met, a playful, imaginative boy who built ramps and raced motorcycles down hospital corridors. Not the quiet, sick child he remembered sitting beside hospital beds. One time, Lily said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, we got in trouble because we were being too loud. Tommy told the nurse we were practicing to be in the motorcycle circus. Caleb smiled, picturing his son's earnest face telling that story. The nurse didn't get mad? He asked. No, Lily said. She just told us the motorcycle circus was closed for nap time. They both laughed softly, the sound hanging in the evening air. He would have liked that you fixed it, Lily said after a moment, handing the toy back to Caleb so he could examine his handiwork. Caleb turned the small motorcycle over in his hands, seeing it differently now. Not just as a toy, but as a vessel for adventures he'd never witnessed, for a side of his son he was only beginning to discover. Tell me more, he said, returning the motorcycle to Lily. About the games you played. About Tommy. As the evening shadows lengthened across the cemetery grass, their voices mingled, his deep and hesitant, hers high and sure, weaving together the story of a boy they had both loved in different ways. The afternoon sun hung high in the cloudless sky as Caleb paced near the cemetery entrance. He checked his watch for the third time, then glanced at his motorcycle parked just beyond the iron gates. The black Harley gleamed in the sunlight, freshly polished that morning. Caleb had spent hours cleaning every chrome surface until he could see his reflection. He straightened his leather vest and ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair. A nervousness he hadn't felt in years stirred in his stomach. What if she didn't show up today? What if she didn't like the surprise? The sound of a car approaching made him turn. A small sedan pulled up, and Lily emerged from the back seat. The woman driving, her caretaker from the hospital, waved at Caleb. He nodded back, still uncomfortable with being recognized. I'll pick her up in an hour, the woman called through the open window. Yes, ma'am, Caleb replied, his voice gruff but respectful. Lily skipped toward him, wearing a pink sweater and jeans. Her thin face lit up when she spotted him. Mr. Caleb, she called out, waving the toy motorcycle in her hand. I brought Red Lightning. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Good, he said. I got something to show you today. Lily tilted her head, curious. Is it at Tommy's spot? Not exactly. Caleb pointed beyond the gates. It's over there. He led her toward the parking area, his large frame moving slowly to match her small steps. When they rounded the corner and his Harley came into view, Lily stopped in her tracks. Her mouth formed a perfect O. Is that? She whispered. My motorcycle, Caleb finished. The real thing. Lily approached the bike with reverence, as if it were some mythical creature. The black Harley-Davidson Road King sat majestically on its kickstand, its engine silent but powerful. It's so big, she exclaimed, standing beside the massive machine. The top of her head barely reached the handlebars. Caleb patted the leather seat. Tommy used to call it the dragon. The dragon, Lily repeated with wonder. She held up her toy motorcycle. Red Lightning and the dragon. They're family, Caleb said. The words came easily, surprising him. Lily circled the motorcycle, examining every detail with intense concentration. Her small fingers hovered over the chrome exhaust pipes, but didn't touch. It's hot after riding, Caleb explained. But it's cool now. You can touch it if you want. Tentatively, Lily placed her palm against the fuel tank, feeling the smooth, cool metal. Tommy said you let him sit on it sometimes, she said, looking up at him with hopeful eyes. Caleb's heart twisted. He remembered those rare occasions. Tommy perched on the seat, tiny hands gripping the handlebars, giggling with delight. That's right, he said. Would you like to? Lily nodded eagerly, bouncing on her toes. All right then. Caleb lifted her with ease, his strong arms carefully placing her on the leather seat. Hold onto the handlebars, but don't touch these buttons. He pointed to the various controls. Lily gripped the handlebars, her legs dangling well above the footrests. Her face shone with pure joy. I'm on a real motorcycle, she announced to the world. That you are, Caleb said, keeping one hand ready to steady her. Does it go really fast? She asked, making engine noises. Faster than anything, Caleb said, but only when it's safe. Tommy said you could outrun the wind. Caleb chuckled. Your friend had a big imagination. Can you make it roar? Lily asked, eyes pleading. Caleb hesitated, glancing around. The cemetery was nearly empty, just a few visitors far across the grounds. Just once, he decided. Hold tight. He reached past her and turned the key in the ignition. With a practiced motion, he pressed the starter button. The Harley rumbled to life, its deep growl filling the air. Lily squealed with delight, her laughter rising above the engine's roar. It's alive, she shouted, beaming at him. Caleb let the engine idle for just a moment before shutting it down. But that brief sound had transformed Lily. She sat taller on the seat, pretending to twist an imaginary throttle, making her own motorcycle sounds. Vroom, vroom, look at me, Mr. Caleb. I'm riding the dragon. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Caleb's chest as he watched her. For the first time since Tommy's death, laughter, real, unrestrained laughter, escaped from deep within him. The sound surprised them both. Lily giggled in response, and soon they were both laughing together, their joy echoing in the quiet afternoon air. For a precious moment, the weight of grief lifted from Caleb's shoulders. The cemetery, the loss, the pain, all faded away, leaving only this perfect instant of happiness. The laughter between them slowly faded into a comfortable silence. Lily remained seated on the motorcycle, her small hands still gripping the handlebars. Caleb stood beside her, his large frame protective and watchful. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking area. Tommy and I made a secret handshake, Lily said suddenly. For club members only. Caleb nodded, curious. How does it go? Lily extended her small hand toward him. First you slap palms, then you fist bump, then you wiggle your fingers like this. She demonstrated the last part with a flourish. Caleb's large, calloused hand engulfed hers as they went through the motions. He felt oddly honored to be included in this ritual. Now you're officially in the club, Lily declared, with a solemn nod. Didn't know I needed permission to join my own kids' club, Caleb said, a hint of humor in his voice. Tommy said you were already the president, Lily replied. But we still needed to do the handshake. Caleb helped her down from the motorcycle, and she stood looking up at him. Something in her expression shifted, becoming more serious. I need to tell you something important, she said, her voice suddenly smaller. What's that? Caleb asked, kneeling down to her level. Lily fidgeted with the toy motorcycle in her hands. Tommy and I promised not to keep secrets from each other. Caleb nodded, waiting patiently. We met in the special wing, she continued. The one for kids who have the same sickness. The air around Caleb seemed to still. A coldness crept into his chest. Tommy told me not to be scared, Lily said, her eyes meeting his directly. He said it's just another road we have to ride. Caleb's throat tightened. The realization struck him like a physical blow. This tiny, bright girl standing before him had the same illness that took his son. You have... He couldn't finish the sentence. Lily nodded matter-of-factly. The same thing Tommy had. That's why we understood each other. Caleb fought to keep his expression steady. His mind raced back to the hospital rooms, the endless tests, the doctors with their grim faces. All of it flashed before him in a heartbeat. Sometimes I get tired really fast, Lily continued, seemingly unbothered. And I have to take lots of yucky medicine. But the doctors say I'm tough. You are tough, Caleb managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. Lily touched the motorcycle patch on his vest. Tommy said Hell's Angels never show when they're scared. He tried to be brave like you. The words pierced Caleb's heart. All the times he'd hidden his fear from his son, thinking it was strength. All the tears he'd swallowed back, believing they were weakness. Being scared is okay, Caleb said, surprising himself with the words. Even Hell's Angels get scared sometimes. Lily considered this new information with a serious expression. Even you? Caleb nodded. Even me. She seemed satisfied with his answer. That's good, because sometimes I get scared too. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lily's face was illuminated in the golden light, making her look almost otherworldly. Caleb saw in that moment just how thin she was, how delicate. The shadows beneath her eyes that he'd overlooked before, the slight pallor to her skin. Do you want to walk back to Tommy's spot? She asked, seemingly unaware of the emotional earthquake she'd just caused. Caleb nodded, unable to form words. He extended his hand, and Lily took it without hesitation, her small fingers wrapped around his thumb, trusting and fragile. They walked in silence back toward the cemetery. With each step, Caleb felt a growing sense of dread and purpose tangling inside him. This child, this brave, remarkable child, was walking the same dark path his son had traveled. But this time, the road wouldn't be walked alone. At Tommy's grave, Lily placed her toy motorcycle on the headstone. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. Caleb stood motionless, watching her. The realization of her condition settled over him like a heavy cloak, leaving him stunned and silent as darkness began to fall. Caleb's boots hit the floor of his darkened apartment with a heavy thud. The ride home had been a blur, his mind too full of Lily's words to notice the road. He hadn't even bothered to turn on the lights when he entered. Instead, he moved through the familiar shadows to his bedroom and sat heavily on the edge of his unmade bed. He said it's just another road we have to ride. Lily's voice echoed in his head. The same illness. The same battle his son had fought and lost. Caleb ran a rough hand over his face, feeling the stubble beneath his palm. The digital clock on his nightstand cast a red glow across the room. 11:43 p.m. Sleep wouldn't come tonight. He knew that already. He stretched out on the bed fully clothed, staring up at the ceiling where headlights from passing cars sent occasional beams crawling across the plaster. The leather of his vest creaked as he shifted, trying to find comfort where there was none to be had. Tommy said, Hell's Angels never show when they're scared. Caleb's chest tightened. Is that what his son had seen? A father too afraid to show fear, too locked up to show anything at all? He'd thought he was being strong for Tommy, steady, reliable. But maybe he'd just been distant when his boy needed him most. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty. It had felt that way since the funeral. But tonight, the silence pressed in harder. making it difficult to breathe. Caleb sat up suddenly and switched on the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room, revealing the disarray he'd been living in. Clothes scattered on the floor. Unwashed dishes in the sink, visible through the bedroom doorway. Dust gathering on picture frames he couldn't bear to look at. He stood and walked to the dresser where a small, framed photo sat face down. With hesitant fingers, he lifted it. Tommy smiled back at him, a gap-toothed grin beneath a baseball cap too big for his head. Caleb had taken him to his first game that day. The memory hit like a physical blow. Tommy's excitement, the sticky soda spilled on both their jeans, the way the boy had fallen asleep on the ride home. "I get tired really fast," Lily had said. Caleb placed the photo upright on the dresser and moved to the kitchen. The overhead light flickered as he turned it on. He filled a glass with water from the tap and leaned against the counter, drinking slowly. The clock on the microwave read 12:17 a.m. How many nights had Tommy lain awake in pain, while Caleb slept unaware in the next room? How many times had the boy hidden his fear, trying to be like his father? Even Hell's Angels get scared sometimes. Caleb set the empty glass down with a sharp click. For years, he'd believed that being a man, being a father, meant swallowing pain, hiding weakness. The club had taught him that. Life had taught him that. But what had he taught Tommy? And what about Lily? That tiny girl with her brave smile and matter-of-fact acceptance of her own mortality. She'd seen straight through him, just like Tommy had. Caleb moved to the living room window and pulled back the curtain. The street below was empty, the neighboring buildings dark except for a few scattered windows. Somewhere out there, Lily was sleeping. Or maybe lying awake like him, facing fears no child should have to face. He let the curtain fall back into place and returned to his bedroom. The clock read 1:35 a.m. He lay back on the bed, this time removing his boots and vest. Sleep remained distant, but his mind had shifted from churning chaos to a strange, clear determination. Tomorrow, he would return to the cemetery, not just to visit his son's grave, but to be there when Lily came. To really be there, present in a way he hadn't been able to be for Tommy. He couldn't change the past, couldn't go back and be the father his son had needed. But maybe, just maybe, he could be something for this girl who walked the same hard road. As dawn's first light crept through his window, Caleb finally drifted into a fitful sleep. His last conscious thought, a promise. He wouldn't let Lily face this alone. The next evening, Caleb arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. The sun still hung well above the horizon, painting everything in warm, golden light. He parked his motorcycle and walked the familiar path to his son's grave, a small paper bag clutched in his hand. At Tommy's headstone, he knelt and brushed away a few fallen leaves. "Hey, kid," he said softly, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "I'm here." He settled onto the grass to wait, determined that when Lily appeared, she would find him ready. Not just physically present, but truly there, in all the ways that mattered. The last golden rays of sunlight stretched across the cemetery, casting long shadows between the headstones. Caleb shifted his weight on the patch of grass where he'd been sitting for nearly an hour. He glanced again at his watch, then back toward the cemetery entrance. Still no sign of Lily. The small gift bag beside him crinkled as he adjusted it. Inside was a children's book about motorcycles he'd found at the corner store that morning. The cashier had given him a curious look, a hulking man in leather buying a picture book, but Caleb hadn't cared. He'd imagined Lily's smile when she opened it. "She'll be here," he murmured to Tommy's headstone, running his calloused fingers over the smooth marble. Probably just running late. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the first hint of evening chill. Caleb zipped his leather jacket higher and settled back against the large oak tree that stood sentinel near his son's grave. He'd never waited this long before. Usually, Lily arrived like clockwork, almost the same time as him, as if they shared some unspoken agreement about when to meet. The cemetery's groundskeeper passed by, pushing a wheelbarrow loaded with tools. He nodded at Caleb, no longer surprised by the biker's daily presence. Caleb nodded back, then checked his watch again. Nearly 15 minutes had passed since he last looked. Maybe her mom had errands, Caleb said aloud, continuing his one-sided conversation with Tommy's grave. Or doctor stuff. The words hung in the air, uncomfortable and weighty. The reality of Lily's illness pressed against his chest. As the minutes stretched into another hour, the shadows grew longer, darker. The golden light faded to dusky purple. Other cemetery visitors, the few there were, departed one by one until only Caleb remained, a solitary figure among the stones. He picked up the gift bag, then set it down again. His fingers tapped against his knee in an uneven rhythm. Worry began to gnaw at him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. The club had taught him that worry was useless. You either handled problems or you didn't. But this feeling couldn't be pushed away so easily. Caleb stood and paced the small area around Tommy's grave. 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. The motion didn't help. He stopped and stared down the path that led to the cemetery entrance, willing Lily's small form to appear. She'll be here tomorrow, he told himself firmly. Everyone misses a day sometimes. But even as he said it, Caleb knew this was different. Lily hadn't missed a single visit since he'd met her. And after yesterday, after she'd told him about her illness, something felt wrong about her absence. The first stars appeared overhead as true darkness began to settle. Caleb reluctantly gathered the gift bag and turned toward the parking lot. Each step away from Tommy's grave felt heavier than the last. At his motorcycle, he paused, looking back at the darkened cemetery. The headstones stood like silent sentinels in the gathering night. For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt the old familiar numbness trying to creep back in, that protective wall between himself and his feelings. This time, he pushed it away. "Something's wrong," he muttered, swinging his leg over his bike. The engine roared to life, echoing in the quiet evening air. As he rode home through the darkened streets, Caleb couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled into his bones. The apartment would be empty and silent when he arrived. The gift bag on the seat beside him would remain unopened. And somewhere, Lily was missing. Caleb gripped the handlebars tighter as he leaned into a turn. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow he would return, and if Lily wasn't there, he would find out why. The thought of her facing her illness alone, just as Tommy had once felt alone despite Caleb's physical presence, was unbearable. The night air rushed past him, cold against his face, but the chill he felt went deeper than skin. The cemetery looked different in the morning light. Caleb had never come this early before. Dew still clung to the grass, and the air held a crisp freshness that would burn away once the sun climbed higher. He parked his motorcycle at the entrance, its rumbling engine falling silent as he switched it off. 7:30 in the morning, hours earlier than his usual visit. Caleb walked the familiar path to Tommy's grave, the gift bag from yesterday still clutched in his hand. The book inside crinkled against the thin paper. He settled onto the damp grass, not caring about the moisture seeping through his jeans. "Morning, buddy," he said quietly to the headstone. "I'm early today. Thought maybe Lily might come by before..." Before what? School? Hospital? Caleb realized how little he actually knew about her daily life. Their connection had formed entirely in this space, within these cemetery grounds. The morning hours passed slowly. Caleb watched the groundskeeper arrive and begin his routine. A couple of early visitors came and went, placing flowers on distant graves. No one approached Tommy's corner of the cemetery. By noon, Caleb's stomach growled, but he ignored it. He'd packed a sandwich and a bottle of water, eating mechanically while keeping his eyes fixed on the cemetery entrance. The gift bag sat beside him, a silent reminder of his purpose. An older woman walking past paused, noticing him. "You've been here quite a while," she said, her voice gentle with concern. "Are you all right?" Caleb nodded stiffly. Just waiting for someone." She smiled sympathetically and continued on. Caleb watched her go, then checked his phone. No messages. Not that he expected any. Who would contact him about Lily? No one knew about their connection. The afternoon sun beat down, warming the air. Caleb removed his leather jacket, folding it carefully beside him. A yellow butterfly landed briefly on Tommy's headstone, wings fluttering, before dancing away on the breeze. The kind of small, beautiful moment Lily would have pointed out. By 4 o'clock, familiar unease had settled deep in Caleb's chest. This was usually when they'd both arrive. Him first, then Lily shortly after. He stood and stretched his legs, walking the perimeter of the cemetery, scanning each path and corner. Nothing. He returned to Tommy's grave and sat again, picking up the gift bag and turning it in his hands. The paper had creased and wrinkled from being carried and set down repeatedly. Caleb smoothed it out gently, trying to make it look nice again. "Where is she, Tommy?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. It's not like her to miss 2 days. A young couple walked past, holding hands, giving him a wide berth. Caleb knew what he must look like, a large tattooed man talking to a child's grave. Once, he wouldn't have cared what strangers thought. Now, he felt their eyes and wondered if they might know something, might recognize Lily if he described her. But he stayed silent, watching them pass. 5 o'clock came and went, then 6. The evening shadows stretched longer across the cemetery grounds. Fewer visitors now. The groundskeeper locked the maintenance shed and left for the day with a distant wave to Caleb. "Just a little longer," Caleb said to Tommy's grave, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. On another day, it would have been beautiful. Today, it just marked another passing hour without Lily. Caleb pulled his jacket back on as the evening coolness settled over the cemetery. Darkness crept in gradually, the headstones turning into shadowy silhouettes. Still, Caleb waited, his broad shoulders hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees. The worry that had started yesterday now felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. Finally, when the stars appeared overhead and the cemetery was completely dark, except for the distant security lights at the entrance, Caleb stood. His knees cracked from sitting so long. He picked up the gift bag, now thoroughly wrinkled, and took one last look around the empty cemetery. "Tomorrow," he promised Tommy's grave. "I'll find out what's happening tomorrow." He walked slowly back to his motorcycle, each step reluctant. The worry had transformed into something larger, something that couldn't be ignored. 2 full days without Lily. Something was definitely wrong. The clock on Caleb's kitchen wall ticked steadily, marking each second of the endless night. It was past midnight, but sleep felt impossible. He moved from the couch to the kitchen and back again, his large frame casting long shadows across the small living room. The house felt emptier than usual, quieter. It had been quiet since Tommy died, but tonight the silence had weight to it. Caleb grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water from the tap. He drank half, then set it down harder than he meant to. "This is stupid," he muttered to himself. "She's just a kid I met at the cemetery." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Lily wasn't just some kid. In the short time he'd known her, she'd become important. She was his link to Tommy, to parts of his son's life he'd never known about. And somewhere along the way, she'd become something more, someone who made him feel human again. Caleb walked to the hallway where Tommy's room remained untouched. The door was closed, as it had been since the funeral. He rested his palm against the wood, but didn't open it. Instead, he returned to the living room and dropped heavily onto the couch. The television remote sat on the coffee table, but he didn't reach for it. TV wouldn't help. Nothing would, except knowing Lily was okay. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and rubbed his face with both hands. His beard was getting longer. He hadn't bothered trimming it lately. "What would you do, Tommy?" he asked the empty room. The answer seemed obvious. Tommy wouldn't just sit around waiting. Tommy, even at 4 years old, had more courage than Caleb had shown his entire life. Caleb stood suddenly and walked to the small desk in the corner. He rummaged through a drawer until he found a notepad and pen. Sitting down, he began writing what he knew about Lily. First name, Lily. Last name, unknown age, 5. Appearance, small for her age, thin brown hair usually in pigtails, often wears a yellow jacket. Connection, knew Tommy from hospital. It wasn't much, too little to go on. Caleb tapped the pen against the paper, thinking. She'd mentioned being in the hospital with Tommy. That was the key. Tomorrow he would go to County General where Tommy had been treated. Someone there must know her. The plan calmed him somewhat, giving him a direction. Still, sleep remained elusive. He paced from window to window, checking the dark street outside, without really knowing what he expected to see. At one point, he found himself in the garage, staring at the workbench where he'd repaired Lily's toy motorcycle. The tiny tools he'd used still lay in a neat row. He picked up the small wrench, remembering how Lily's face had lit up when he returned the fixed toy to her. He said his dad was the leader. She had told him that first day. The leader of their imaginary club. Some leader he was. He couldn't even find one little girl. By the time dawn arrived, Caleb had worn paths in the carpet from his pacing. He showered, the hot water doing little to wash away his worry. He dressed in clean jeans and a button-up shirt, instead of his usual t-shirt. He wanted to look respectable at the hospital, but County General had been a dead end. No one at the reception desk could help him without a last name or patient information. Patient privacy, they explained. The pediatric ward wouldn't even let him in, without being on an approved visitor list. His frustration mounted with each closed door, each apologetic headshake. By late afternoon, he'd tried every approach he could think of. He'd described Lily to every staff member who would listen. No one recognized her from his description, or if they did, they couldn't say. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Caleb parked his motorcycle at the cemetery entrance again. The gift bag from yesterday sat in his saddlebag, even more crumpled than before. He didn't bother taking it out. His walk to Tommy's grave was quicker today, almost hurried. His eyes darted around the cemetery grounds, searching every pathway, every bench. His heart jumped when he spotted a small figure in the distance, only to sink when he realized it was a short woman, not a child. Caleb reached the grave and stood beside it, unable to sit. His fingers drummed against his thigh as he scanned the cemetery entrance. Every few minutes he checked his watch, counting down to the time Lily usually arrived. When that time came and went, the anxiety in his chest tightened its grip. He paced in small circles around Tommy's headstone, stopping every few seconds to look toward the entrance. "Come on, kid," he whispered. "Where are you?" The sunset painted the cemetery in shades of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Caleb stood rigid beside Tommy's grave, his shoulders tense as his eyes repeatedly scanned the entrance. The evening was unusually quiet. No distant traffic noise, no birds calling, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. "She'll come," Caleb whispered to himself. "She has to." But even as he said the words, the knot in his stomach tightened. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The same terrible feeling he'd had the night before Tommy died. That sense of impending loss that hovered like a storm cloud. He checked his watch again. Nearly 20 minutes past the time Lily usually arrived. Caleb rubbed his beard, the coarse hair rough against his calloused palm. Maybe she was just late. Maybe whoever brought her got held up. Maybe... The sound of footsteps on the gravel path broke through his thoughts. Caleb's head snapped up, hope flaring briefly before reality doused it. This wasn't Lily's light, quick step. These footsteps were measured, adult. A woman in light blue scrubs made her way up the path toward him. She was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She walked with the purposeful stride of someone who was always short on time. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Hospital scrubs. His hands clenched involuntarily at his sides as the woman approached. She slowed as she neared Tommy's grave, her eyes moving from the headstone to Caleb's face. Recognition flickered in her expression. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. Caleb stood perfectly still, as if movement might somehow prevent whatever news she carried. "Yes," he managed to say, the word barely audible. The nurse stopped a respectful distance away. Her name badge read, Helen Rivera, RN. "I thought it was you," she said. "I remembered you from the hospital, from when Tommy was with us." Caleb nodded stiffly. He couldn't bring himself to ask the question burning in his mind. Instead, he simply waited, heart hammering against his ribs. Nurse Rivera glanced at Tommy's headstone, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "I'm sorry for your loss. Tommy was special. All the nurses loved him." "Thank you," Caleb said automatically. The words felt hollow, practiced from too much repetition at the funeral. A beat of silence passed between them. The sun dipped lower, the golden light fading to dusky purple. "You've been coming here every day," the nurse said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Caleb shifted his weight, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You've seen me?" She nodded. "A few times. I visit my mother's grave on Thursdays." She paused, then added, "Recently, I noticed you weren't alone." Caleb's throat tightened. "Lily," he said simply. Recognition softened her features. "Yes, Lily Carter. I've been her primary nurse for the past year." "You know her," Caleb said, relief flooding through him. "Is she okay?" "Where is she?" "She hasn't been here for days." Nurse Rivera's expression changed subtly. The professional mask slipped just enough for Caleb to see compassion and something darker beneath. She clasped her hands together in front of her. "Mr. Mercer, I came looking for you because—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Lily mentioned you. Several times, actually. She told us about meeting Tommy's father at the cemetery, how you fixed her toy motorcycle." Caleb nodded impatiently. "Where is she?" The nurse took a deep breath. "She's back in the hospital, Mr. Mercer. Her condition worsened suddenly 4 days ago." The world seemed to tilt slightly under Caleb's feet. 4 days. Exactly when she'd stopped coming. "How bad?" he asked, his voice rough. Nurse Rivera's eyes held a quiet sadness that Caleb recognized all too well. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of Tommy's doctors. "I think we should sit down," she said softly, gesturing to the small bench near Tommy's grave. Caleb felt his legs grow heavy as he followed Nurse Rivera to the bench. Each step seemed to take enormous effort, as if he were wading through deep water. The cemetery around them faded into a blur of gray shapes against the darkening sky. They sat side by side, though Caleb perched on the edge of the bench, unable to let himself rest. His large hands gripped his knees, knuckles white. "Mr. Mercer," Nurse Rivera began, her voice soft but steady. "Lily asked me to find you. She was worried you might think she forgot about your meetings." A small sound escaped Caleb's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. Even now, the little girl was thinking of others. "How bad is it?" he asked again, staring straight ahead at Tommy's headstone. The nurse was quiet for a moment. In that silence, Caleb heard everything he needed to know. "She's very ill," Nurse Rivera finally said. "The cancer has spread rapidly. She's comfortable, but—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Caleb nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. "Can I see her?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer." The nurse's voice cracked slightly. "Lily slipped into a coma yesterday evening. The doctors don't expect her to regain consciousness. The words hit Caleb like physical blows. Each one landed with brutal force, knocking away what little hope he had left. He'd known somehow from the moment Lily didn't show up that first evening. He'd felt it in his gut. But hearing it confirmed made it unbearably real. Her mother hasn't left her side, Nurse Rivera continued, but Lily was very insistent about something before she swallowed hard. Before she could no longer speak. The nurse reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was slightly crumpled, as if it had been carried around for some time. His name was written on the front in large, wobbly letters. "She wrote this for you," Nurse Rivera said, holding it out. "She was determined to give it to you herself, but when she realized she couldn't..." Caleb stared at the envelope. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to take it. As long as he didn't read whatever was inside, he could pretend this wasn't happening. That Lily would come skipping up the path tomorrow, full of stories and quiet wisdom. "She's a special little girl," Nurse Rivera said. "She touched so many lives at the hospital, just like Tommy did." At the mention of his son, Caleb finally reached out. His large, weathered hand trembled as he took the envelope. It was so light, so fragile in his palm. "Thank you," he managed to say. Nurse Rivera nodded and stood. "I should get back to the hospital. Will you be all right?" Caleb couldn't answer. He simply nodded, not trusting his voice. "If you want to come to the hospital," she began. "I will," Caleb said quickly. "Tomorrow morning." With a gentle touch to his shoulder, Nurse Rivera left, her footsteps fading down the gravel path. Caleb sat alone on the bench, the envelope clutched in his hands. The cemetery had grown dark now, the headstones ghostly shapes in the twilight. He could barely make out the words on Tommy's grave. With fingers that felt numb and clumsy, he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. He unfolded it slowly, as if it might crumble to dust at any moment. The paper was hospital stationery, torn from a notepad. On it, in the large, uneven handwriting of a child, was Lily's message. "Thank you for letting me be in your club. Your son said you were strong, but I think you're kind too. I'm not scared anymore. He said you'd help me if I got lost. I think you already did." Below the words was a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, a tall one with a beard, and 2 small ones. Above them was a yellow sun with a smiling face. Something broke inside Caleb. The wall he'd built around his heart since Tommy's death, the wall that had already begun to crack because of Lily, collapsed completely. A sound tore from his throat, raw and animal-like. He doubled over on the bench, clutching the letter to his chest as if it were Lily herself. Tears came in a flood, unstoppable and violent, shaking his entire body. "No," he gasped between sobs. "Not again. Please, not again." He slid from the bench to his knees on the cemetery ground, the damp earth soaking through his jeans. The letter trembled in his hands as he tried to read it again through his tears, desperate to hold on to Lily's words. "I'm not scared anymore," he read aloud, his voice breaking on every word. Caleb collapsed forward, his forehead touching the cool grass. The letter pressed against his heart as grief consumed him entirely. The cemetery had emptied completely by the time Caleb finally raised his head. The moon hung overhead, casting silver light across the rows of headstones. His legs ached from kneeling so long on the hard ground, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony inside him. He looked down at the letter in his hands. The paper had grown damp from his tears, the crayon slightly smudged, but Lily's words remained clear. He traced a rough finger over the childish handwriting, as if he could somehow feel her presence through the marks she had left behind. "Your son said you were strong, but I think you're kind too." Those words cut him deepest. All his adult life, Caleb had built his identity around being feared, being tough. The leather jacket, the tattoos, the silence. They were his armor against a world that had rarely shown him kindness. But here was this little girl, seeing through all of it to something he had buried so deep, he'd forgotten it existed. Caleb shifted his weight, wincing as his knees protested. He moved to sit beside Tommy's headstone, his back against the cool marble. Directly in front of him was the spot where Lily always sat when they talked. He could almost see her there now, skinny legs crossed, hands gesturing as she shared another story. The night air grew colder. Stars appeared one by one in the clear sky above. Caleb didn't move. He couldn't bear the thought of going back to his empty house, to face the silence alone. At least here, surrounded by the dead, his grief had company. He carefully folded Lily's letter and tucked it into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. Then he pulled out the small gift he had brought for her earlier, a tiny silver charm in the shape of a motorcycle that he'd found at a pawnshop. It caught the moonlight as he held it in his palm. "I should have given it to her sooner," he whispered to no one. The sound of his own voice startled him. It seemed too loud in the quiet cemetery, yet somehow right. The silence had been his refuge for too long. Caleb looked at his son's name, carved into the stone. Thomas James Mercer. Below it were the dates marking his too short life, and the words, "Beloved son." Such a small space to contain all that Tommy had been. "I met your friend," Caleb said suddenly, his voice rough. The words felt strange in his mouth, but once he started, they came easier. "Lily, she told me about your club, about the stories you made up." He paused, swallowing hard. "I wish you'd told me about them yourself. I would have liked to hear them." The wind rustled through the trees nearby, lifting fallen leaves in gentle spirals. Caleb watched them dance in the moonlight. "I thought—" His voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I thought I knew what kind of father I was. I thought I failed you. That I wasn't enough." Caleb ran a hand over his beard, feeling the wetness on his cheeks. "But Lily, she showed me how you saw me. All these little things I did that I didn't think mattered. You noticed them all." He closed his eyes, seeing Tommy's face in his memory, not the pale, sick child from the hospital, but his boy laughing, eyes bright with life. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't talk to you more. I'm sorry I didn't know how to show you what you meant to me." Caleb opened his eyes and looked at the empty space where Lily should be sitting. "And, Lily," he said, his voice growing stronger, "I don't know if you can hear me, wherever you are now. But thank you. Thank you for finding me, for showing me who my son really was, who I really am." The motorcycle charm gleamed in his palm. Slowly, carefully, Caleb placed it at the base of Tommy's headstone. "You two take care of each other," he said. "I'll try to be the man you both saw in me." As he spoke these words, something shifted inside Caleb's chest. Not a lessening of pain, but a transformation of it. The grief remained, sharp and present, but alongside it bloomed something new, a sense of purpose, a reason to carry on. For the first time in years, Caleb Mercer felt the faintest stirring of peace. Morning light filtered through Caleb's bedroom window, casting long shadows across the rumpled blankets. He hadn't slept much. His eyes felt raw, his body heavy with exhaustion. But for the first time in weeks, his mind was clear. Caleb showered and dressed with unusual care, choosing a plain black t-shirt instead of his usual club vest. He tucked Lily's letter into his shirt pocket, the paper crinkling against his chest like a talisman. The drive to Memorial Hospital took 20 minutes. He'd made this journey countless times during Tommy's illness, but today felt different. Back then, he'd arrived with dread weighing down his shoulders. Today, something else pushed him forward. He parked his motorcycle in the visitor's lot and sat for a long moment, hands gripping the handlebars even after the engine died. The hospital loomed before him, a giant concrete building with rows of identical windows. Somewhere in there, Lily had spent her final days. "You can do this," he muttered to himself, patting his pocket where the letter rested. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. The familiar hospital smell hit him immediately. Antiseptic and artificial air. His boots squeaked against the polished floor as he approached the information desk. The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. Caleb knew what she saw. A big man with tattoos crawling up his neck, 3-day stubble, and the hard eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He tried to soften his expression. "I'm looking for the children's ward," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. She hesitated. "Are you family?" Caleb's hand moved to his pocket, touching the letter through the fabric. "No, I'm—" What was he? "I'm a friend of Lily Carter's. She passed recently." Understanding dawned in the receptionist's eyes. "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss." She directed him to the 4th floor. The elevator ride felt endless. Caleb studied his reflection in the metal doors, a stranger looking back at him. When had he gotten so old? When had his face set into such hard lines? The children's ward was painted in bright colors, cartoon characters dancing across the walls. It didn't mask the reality of the place, but it tried. A nurse at the station looked up as he approached. "Can I help you?" Caleb cleared his throat. "My name's Caleb Mercer. My son Thomas was treated here, and recently a friend of his named Lily Carter." Recognition flickered in the nurse's eyes. "You're Lily's motorcycle friend. She talked about you." Something tightened in Caleb's chest. "She did?" The nurse nodded. "Said you were teaching her about your club." Her smile was sad, but genuine. "She was a special girl." "She was," Caleb agreed, his voice barely audible. "What can we do for you today, Mr. Mercer?" Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain. He hadn't planned what to say, only knowing he needed to come. "I guess I wanted to, I don't know, do something. For Lily. For the kids here." The nurse studied him for a long moment. "We have some children who don't get many visitors. Sometimes, just having someone sit with them makes all the difference." She led him down the corridor, past rooms filled with beeping machines and small bodies. They stopped outside a room near the end. Through the window, Caleb could see a thin boy, maybe 7 or 8, sitting alone with a book. "This is Danny," the nurse explained softly. "He's been here 3 weeks. His parents work double shifts to cover the bills. They can't visit often." Caleb looked at the boy, dark circles under his eyes, thin arms, hair starting to grow back in patchy spots. He looked so small against the white hospital sheets. "What would I even say to him?" Caleb asked, panic rising. The nurse touched his arm gently. "You don't always have to say anything. Sometimes just being there is enough." Caleb took a deep breath and nodded. He thought of Lily's words in the letter. "Your son said you were strong, but I think you're kind too." Maybe it was time to find out if she was right. He knocked softly on the door frame. The boy looked up, curiosity replacing boredom in his tired eyes. "Hey," Caleb said, his voice rough but quiet. "Mind if I sit with you for a while?" The next morning, Caleb woke with purpose. His house, once a silent shrine to grief, now buzzed with quiet energy as he moved through his morning routine. After his visit with Danny yesterday, something had shifted inside him. Not healed. The wound of losing Tommy and now Lily would never fully close, but changed, redirected. He packed a small duffel bag with items he'd gathered the night before. Coloring books, toy cars, and a few comic books he'd found in a drawer. At the last minute, he added Tommy's old teddy bear, worn at the edges but still soft. It had sat untouched on Tommy's bed for weeks. Now it was time for it to comfort someone else. The hospital staff recognized him when he walked through the sliding doors. A few nurses nodded. One even smiled. The security guard who had once watched him warily now just gave a respectful nod. "Back again, Mr. Mercer?" asked the floor nurse, Diane, as he stepped off the elevator. "Figured the kids might like these," Caleb said, holding up the duffel. Diane's face brightened. "That's very thoughtful. We have a playroom where the children who are well enough can gather. Would you like to visit there today?" The playroom was painted sunny yellow, with small tables and chairs scattered around. 5 children were there, some hooked to portable IV poles, others free to move about, but bearing the unmistakable marks of illness: pale skin, thinning hair, tired eyes that had seen too much pain. Danny spotted him first. "It's the motorcycle man," he called out, his voice stronger than yesterday. The other children looked up with cautious curiosity. Caleb stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly feeling huge and out of place among the tiny chairs and bright toys. "I brought some stuff," he said, unzipping the bag. The children gathered around as he pulled out the treasures. A small girl with a pink bandana covering her head reached for the teddy bear. "What's his name?" she asked. Caleb's throat tightened. "Ryder. His name is Ryder." "Like a motorcycle rider?" asked an older boy. "Yeah," Caleb nodded. "Just like that." That afternoon stretched into hours as Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, helping children color and listening to their stories. They were curious about his tattoos, his motorcycle, his life outside the hospital walls. He answered their questions simply, leaving out the rougher parts of his past. "Were you always this nice?" asked the girl with the bandana, who had introduced herself as Mia. The question caught him off guard. "No," he answered honestly. "I wasn't. But someone taught me how to be better." "Who?" Danny wanted to know. Caleb looked at their expectant faces. "My son," he said quietly. "And a very brave little girl named Lily." The next day, Caleb returned with more toys. The day after that, he brought his old motorcycle magazines with the scary parts cut out, showing the children pictures of gleaming bikes and open roads. He told them stories about riding through canyons and beside ocean cliffs, places many of them had never seen. By the end of the week, he had a regular spot in the playroom. The children waited for him, saving him stories and pictures they'd drawn. Parents began to recognize him too. This large, tattooed man who sat patiently beside their sick children, teaching them to make engine sounds and pretend to ride imaginary motorcycles around the room. On Friday, Diane pulled him aside as he was leaving. "What you're doing here," she said. "It's making a real difference." Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just passing time." "It's more than that," she insisted. "The children talk about you all day. They call themselves your little riders now." Something clicked in Caleb's mind at those words. That night, he stayed up late in his garage, working with focused intensity. When he arrived at the hospital the next morning, he carried a large cardboard box. The children gathered around as he opened it, revealing handmade leather bracelets, each stamped with tiny motorcycle emblems he'd crafted himself. "What are these?" Mia asked, touching one with reverent fingers. "Membership bands," Caleb explained, "for the Little Riders Club." "We're a club?" Danny's eyes widened. Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "In honor of my son, Tommy, and his friend Lily. They started it. Now we're keeping it going." "What do club members do?" asked one of the younger boys. Caleb thought for a moment, remembering the toy motorcycle, the secret world his son had created, the bravery both children had shown. "We ride together," he said simply, "no matter how hard the road gets." A light rain pattered against the leather of Caleb's jacket as he walked up the familiar hill. The cemetery was quiet this morning, with only the occasional visitor placing flowers or standing in silent reflection. Caleb carried no flowers, only the tiny toy motorcycle in his pocket and a weight of purpose in his chest. It had been 2 weeks since he'd started the Little Riders Club at the hospital. 2 weeks of watching sick children's faces light up with stories and small treasures. 2 weeks of slowly feeling something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. He paused at the crest of the hill, looking down at the two small headstones set side by side. The cemetery staff had been kind when he'd asked if Lily could be buried near Tommy. Now, the two graves looked like they belonged together, companions even in this quiet place. "Hey, kids," Caleb said softly as he approached. His voice was still rough, but no longer strangled by grief. "Sorry I haven't been by for a few days." The rain had eased to a misty drizzle that clung to his beard and hair. Caleb lowered himself to the damp grass, sitting cross-legged between the graves. He pulled the toy motorcycle from his pocket and set it carefully on Tommy's headstone. "I've been busy," he continued. "The club is growing. Got 15 kids now wearing those leather bands. Hospital staff keeps asking when they can join." A weak ray of sunshine broke through the clouds, catching on the headstones and making the wet granite gleam. Caleb watched it spread across the cemetery, lighting up the trees and distant markers. "Danny's doing better. His mom says the treatments are working." Caleb adjusted his position, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "Mia loves that teddy bear Tommy. Carries Ryder everywhere with her. Won't even let the nurses touch him during procedures." The wind rustled through the leaves overhead, creating a gentle whisper that somehow made the cemetery feel less lonely. Caleb reached out, placing one hand on each headstone, bridging the small gap between them. "Some of my club brothers came by yesterday," he said, a slight smile forming beneath his beard. "You should have seen the nurses' faces when 6 Hells Angels walked in with stuffed animals." His chuckle was soft but real. "Even Razor showed up. Remember him, Tommy? The one with the snake tattoo you always liked. Turns out his nephew had the same thing you did. Lost him 3 years back." Caleb fell silent for a moment, listening to the birds that had begun to sing as the rain stopped completely. "We're planning something bigger now," he continued. "Razor's good with paperwork. Who knew? We're setting up a real charity, going to help families with hospital bills, maybe do some motorcycle rides to raise money." He shook his head in wonder. "The guys are all in. Every last one of them." He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a small, laminated photo. It showed a group of children in hospital gowns, each wearing a leather bracelet, smiling alongside several intimidating-looking bikers who seemed somehow gentle despite their appearance. "First official club photo," Caleb said, propping it against Lily's headstone. "Thought you both should have a copy." The sun was fully out now, burning away the morning mist and warming Caleb's shoulders. He took a deep breath, feeling the damp earth beneath him, the solid stone under his palms, the gentle breeze on his face. "I think I get it now," he said quietly. "What you were trying to show me, Tommy. What you saw in me that I couldn't see. And Lily—" His voice caught slightly. "Lily, you were right. I can be kind. I just forgot how for a while." Caleb slowly got to his feet, brushing grass from his jeans. He looked down at the 2 small graves, now bathed in morning sunlight. "You two started something important," he said. "Something that's helping a lot of people now. I promise I'll keep it going." He touched each headstone one last time, then turned to walk back down the hill. As he reached the cemetery gate, he paused and looked back, a gentle smile crossing his face. "The club rides on," he said softly, before turning toward his motorcycle and the road beyond. "I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day."